Good morning. It is so good to be back. Last week I went to Eufaula and worshiped with the church there in Eufaula with my father. Very, very cool to get to do things like that. I hope you guys enjoyed the lesson that was brought by Don English and the ministry and the things that he's trying to accomplish with Burnt Cabin. Some very, very cool stuff going on there. It's a very influential place for our youth, and looking forward to the camp session coming up in June. Who knows it? I think I say this every year, but I think this will be my last year of going, and so it's a really special place, though. It's a very, very special place. A couple of weeks ago, Tim brought up one of my favorite quotes from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, discussing the claim of Jesus being just a teacher or just a moral person. And I think the quote is this: "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God." That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says that he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. What a powerful thought. Because this idea that Jesus was not the Son of God, Jesus was not deity, is not a new thought. This is something that is taught out there. In fact, I'm reading a lot about sociologists in the 19th century, sociologists that basically turned the education system from a theological base to a more humanistic, naturalistic, scientific base. In fact, basically throwing anything theology or religion away into the wastebasket, saying that it had no place in a higher education. And a lot of these same sociologists are the ones that want to make the teachings of Jesus just that of a good moral, a good ethics, good things that he brought. Because they can't question or challenge the historicity or the history of Jesus. He was a historical figure. Even those academics, those agnostics, those atheists, most everybody agrees Jesus was a historical person. And the things that he did, they want to say he never claimed to be God. And that's the part that C.S. Lewis is addressing. And today we're going to continue into one of my favorite stories, the stories in Mark, and it's also in Luke and Matthew in chapters 8 in both of those books. And that's the calming of the storm. Now, the calming of the storm, it comes right on the end of those block teachings that we saw in the previous chapter, where Mark has taken these stories, these events, these parables, and he's placed them in what I would probably call a theological order. He's trying to get a message across with those. It wasn't chronological, but it was definitely with intent and purpose. And now we're moving into this event where Jesus is being put onto a boat and is going to be moved across the Sea of Galilee. And what we're about to see in the next three stories in Mark 4, verses 35 through the end of chapter 5, are three very dramatic miracle events over some of the things that the people of this time, these first century, these folks would see as he's going to demonstrate power over natural elements, over demons, and over death. And this is the non-human forces that most threatened human life in their way of viewing things. So, just like most of what Mark does, we're going to see him at his most human and at his most divine. It's going to be a very interesting way of placing Jesus, portraying him in both aspects that he has tried so hard to make sure he gets across in his work. So the calming of the storm in vivid detail. Now, when you read Mark, you're going to see it different than you're going to see it in Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke, one commentarian calls it flattens a lot of what we read about this event. But Mark's going to give some details, and he's going to go into a little more detail than the others. Specifically, you're going to see the hour of the day. There's a presence of other boats. You don't really ever think about that, but there's other boats along with this boat. It talks about the boats taking in water in verse 37, and that Jesus is sleeping on a cushion in verse 38. And you hear the disciples' almost sarcasm in what they say to him, and that's going to be a major difference that we'll address in the three versions as well. And then, of course, the words, the rebuke that Jesus brings. And it's obvious that this is eyewitness testimony. This is more than just a summation of what happened. This is somebody relaying what they saw. And more than likely, this is Peter's eyewitness testimony that Mark is relaying to us. So these particulars are firsthand narration. Peter's more than likely the source, and it's going to take us back to some very important historical Old Testament stories that it's going to bring us back to Jonah, and then in Psalm chapter 107. There's going to be a lot of things that you can, on your own study, go back and take a look at Jonah and look at the similarities and the dissimilarities. The one prophet wanting to get away, one prophet going towards, one prophet praying to God to calm the storm, the other calming with his own words. There's a lot there, the fear of the sailors. There's a lot there of similarities, and then notice the dissimilarities and what that tells you about who Jesus was. So we see this. We're going to see a little more in Psalm 107 in just a second. But Jesus has entered a boat. They're taking him on the boat, and they're going to take him across the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, they're going to travel eastward across the lake, and it lies 700 feet below sea level in a basin surrounded by hills and mountains. And especially the east side of the mountain is very steep and very high. And it's 30 miles to the northeast of Mount Hermon, which is going to rise about 9,200 feet above sea level. This is going to cause a lot of very violent situations weather-wise, because the upper air from Mount Hermon is going to mix with that lower, warmer air from the sea. And it's going to make some violent weather patterns that even today the sailors still talk about what they call the sharkia, which means shark. It's a easterly that is very violent, and it's a furious squall. Now, a squall is an interesting word, because I think of gusts. Now, in a couple of weeks, Colin and I are traveling out to Monterey, California to do a marathon. I am probably not going to finish because I haven't trained nearly as well as he has, but they talk about these gusts that we're going to face along Highway 1. And a gust sounds horrible, and it is bad, but it's seconds of heavy, fast, hard wind. It's a gust, seconds of it. A squall is minutes of it, and it creates situations like what happened in Portugal there, where that light tower is taking on the waves created by a squall. Now, squalls are violent, and we have some fishermen that are very aware of the situation in the Sea of Galilee. Some of the disciples have been in these situations, and they recognize what's happening. And it's a commotion. We've got the wind starting. We've got the waves becoming large. And where is Jesus? He's asleep on a cushion. Now, ironically, this is the only place in Scripture where we read Jesus sleeping. Now, where's his spidey senses here? Doesn't he know this is coming? What is he asleep for? And how do the disciples react to him sleeping? Now, in Matthew, they wake him and they say, "Save us." In Luke, they wake him and they say, We're about to perish. In Mark, they say, what are you doing? We're about to die. Don't you care? Have you no concern? We're about to perish. Now, there is a boat that they found. They've dug up, archaeology dig that is similar to what they believe would have been this time period. And this, Rembrandt's version of it's a little off, but it is a smaller boat. It would only fit about 15 people, about, I think, 6 Roman. And then there would be a place where Jesus could be asleep there and on the stern. And it's ironic, this is the one time he's asleep. This is the one time the disciples have to wake him and show him the fear that they have. And isn't it amazing what happens next? They say, "Teacher, is it not a concern to you? We are perishing." And this is, other than, I think, verse 37 in the first chapter where they say, everyone's looking for you, this is the next time we see the disciples actually talking. This is the next time we hear words coming from the disciples' mouth to Jesus. And it's fear, and it's doubt. And they say, aren't you concerned? And what does Jesus do? He rebukes the wind. And it's the same phraseology. It's the same thing we saw him do in chapter 1 when he rebuked the demons. Jesus tells the sea to keep calm or be still. And immediately the sea's muzzled, which is the actual Greek word there. Now, how many of you guys have thrown a rock out on the water? What happens? Yeah, it ripples. It still goes for a while. What happens after a storm? Anybody been on a boat after a big storm? How long are you going to rock in that boat? Think about this miracle that occurred. Not only did he stop the wind, he stilled the water completely. The calmness of the sea. It's not choppy, it's calm after that storm. That's the miracle. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this, and I'm going to leave it to your personal study because there's a lot of material on it, but I'll just address on it a little. But the sea in the Old Testament and in biblical literature and ancient Eastern, Near Eastern literature as well, the sea has some very symbolic overtones. The Canaanite Canaanite mythologies will show the sea as chaos, as it's where the evil comes from. It's like possessed. And that's why it's very interesting that the words that Mark is using here similarly sounds like when he exorcised the demon. And you'll see that if you remember the sea, the waters of chaos in Genesis, you can see the monsters that come from the sea, the Leviathan, all these things that are representative of this unknown, where the monsters lie, the evil lies deep within the sea. And it's a representation that continues even through the New Testament, because in John, or in Revelation, John's going to relate that when the time comes, even the sea will go away. The sea did not exist any longer. It's a little symbolism that when they're reading this, they're getting more than what our modern eyes get when we read this. Jesus is treating the sea like a personified force of evil, or at least in this grip of evil. A lot of people will want to just call this a nature miracle with hyperbole, but when you relate the things that we've seen in Mark so far, this is more like Jesus being the strong man that takes on Satan and his demonic forces. And it's going to continue into these next two miracles that we're about to see. And if you remember the evil minion, Satan, he's going to show his power over these forces is one way of viewing some of this. I did a project on this specific story in one of the classes that I'm taking, and that was one of the things the professor wanted to point out to me as I went in. Did you research what the sea represented, the chaos, the evil? And it's there. There's a lot of material on it, especially if you take a look at the ancient Near East, the things that were going on and the way they would recognize this language. So, how do the disciples respond to what they've seen? Now, remember, they were afraid. They were afraid because of what? They were afraid because of the storm. And the storm was about to make them perish, and they understood their plight. They understood what they were looking at. They were about to die, and there was fear. But now, it's calm. But has their demeanor really changed much? They say, who is this that can still the storm? Who is this? Remember, we talked about insiders and outsiders. These are the insiders. They know who Jesus is, but they don't know who Jesus is. Because how do they address him? They address him as teacher, right? They address him as teacher, and they know he's their teacher, but they don't understand who he is yet. They know they can trust him, but they don't understand why yet. And they clearly, in this story, are going to be asking the question, who is this? And this ties together the two main themes of Mark, the Christology and the discipleship, because we now have seen, who is this? Well, the Old Testament tells us there's only one that can still the seas. That Psalms 107. When you go home today, take a look at that section in Psalms 107, specifically verse 29. He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea were hushed. That was God. The language and pattern of this is very similar to Psalm, and it's unmistakably echoing it. So in the Old Testament, God's the only one that could possess this ability to quell natural storms. You can see this over and over in Psalms. I think there's 4 or 5 spots in Psalms where the storm is quelled by God. And in this story, Mark's he's telling us without ambiguity that Jesus had the same power and authority as God had in those Old Testament scriptures. In their Hebrew scriptures, Jesus is showing and displaying who he is. So, Christology and discipleship, we see that, and Jesus is going to ask his disciples, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? Do you have no faith? So, do you believe that Jesus is being critical of the disciples' lack of faith at this point? Or do you think he's being critical of their fear and doubt? He knows they don't know who he is yet, but he's demonstrating it to them every day, and he knows it's coming. So the reproach to me sounds like it's the fear and the doubt that he's questioning. And how do they continue to respond with this, who then is this? It's back to fear again. It's back to fear because they are in the presence of the supernatural. They recognize God is the only one that can do this kind of stuff. And they are afraid. They're afraid similarly to the fear they had when they thought they were about to die, when they were in the middle of a storm. And we've all been in those storms at night where I see my mom here. I didn't know they were going to be here. But out on Lynn Lane, when I would be in my mom and granddad's house when I was little, when those storms would come and those lights would go out because the electricity would be out, and we'd have to start looking for the kerosene lamps, and I'd be out scared that this was the last day on earth I would ever have. I know we've all had that feeling. That's the feeling they had. They thought this was their last moments. And now that the sea is calm, now their fear is more of, who is this? Who really is this? So, Mark is going to take us from this place, and he's going to take us to another scene, a scene among the tombs. Now, we are going to see a person. We saw the sea of this uncalmness. We saw this storm that had made itself apparent on the sea. But now we're going to see what one commentarian calls the chaos and storm within this man, and how Jesus is going to prevail over this as well. Now, this is the story of the Gerasene demoniac. Now, right from the beginning, again, there's lots of things you can study about these different lessons, a lot of things that we can address. And since I apparently have been running out of time every week, I'm not going to try to address all the really cool things that there is to address. But I think it's really important for all of us to know when academics attack things. Because what I don't want is, I don't want somebody sitting with somebody having a discussion and hear for the first time a challenge that you really don't have a prepared response for. In law, they tell you never ask a question you don't know the answer to. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. So in this case, I think it's important to recognize that there is questions about the place that this is occurring. And for example, the only places with a name similar to this is a little far away from where there would be cliffs and a place for what we're going to see, the swine going off. And in fact, the city of Gerasa, which is modern Jerish, is not on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, but it's 37 miles away. So it's inland 37 miles. So if this is the place that the academics want to place it, then it would be difficult to believe that these pigs were going to run that far before entering the sea. So there's all kinds of suggestions, and there's even been some archaeology in 1970 that has uncovered a city that has a name that they've determined that Semitically would sound like this word. But the point is this: wherever this is, wherever Jesus is relaying this, or wherever Mark is relaying this, the story is coming from an inspired writer of the Bible. And unless they can prove otherwise, it is absolutely true. So just because they want to throw a dart at something doesn't mean they're going to hit a target. And they threw darts at this. One of the great things about archaeology is it can't tell you the stuff it can't find. So it's not a denial of a fact because something's not found. Facts are driven by what's found, not what's by not found. So it's one of those interesting things that it's a logical fallacy. It's a logical fallacy to try to say that because they don't know exactly where this city is or was, that it must not be true. So anyway, so the skeptics would make that analysis that it didn't exist. The truth is, we don't know where it was, but we do know that we're going to read something very powerful. And Mark wants us to see some things about this place and the person that is about to be healed or exorcised the demons from. And we'll go ahead and start in chapter 5, verse 1. And they came to the other side of the sea, the region of the Gerasenes. And as he was getting out of the boat, immediately from the tombs, a man with unclean spirit went to meet him, who lived among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him any longer, even with the chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles had been shattered, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. So there is so much going on here that you have to recognize the uncleanness that Mark is throwing at us. Number one, we are in the Gentile Decapolis. Okay, this is along the eastern shore. 10 cities. I think one is actually on the western shore, but 10 cities known as the Decapolis. Beth Shan is on the west side of the Jordan. These cities were they were taken by Pompey and when invaded in 63 BC, and they became the showcase cities of the Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture, and the ideals. Now, Josephus in War talks a lot about what the Decapolis represented to their culture. It was Gentile. It was Gentile through and through. So we are in Gentile land. Now, we are now being approached by a man from the tombs. Now, the tombs, that's where dead people are. And there's several examples of tombs, and I've got to remember to keep clicking. In Numbers 19, what were they supposed to do with folks that were polluted by the tombs? Well, they had to be purified. So anyone who failed to purify himself from the pollution of the tombs must be cut off from Israel. So if you were in the tombs, you couldn't be with Jews, period. He lived there. That's where he was. And the Torah would even expand on that. The rabbinic rules, their interpretation would extend this uncleanness to not only being in the tombs, but just having contact with anything that's anything associated with the tombs. If you touched or associated with at all, you were cut off from Israel. Now, to make it even worse, so we're over in Gentile land, we're dealing with somebody living in the tombs. What profession of people were all around this area? We had swine herders. Now, swine herders, we know what Leviticus and Deuteronomy says about the swine, and then Mishnah is going to even take it a little further. It says, none may rear swine anywhere. That's how important it was to stay away from the swine. So, categorically, none may rear swine anywhere. Now, the Roman staple foods were grain and corn. But if they could get pig, if they could get meat, that was a delicacy. So think of this. In Gentile land, among the tombs, among swine herders, and more than likely, based on where they are, these swine were being bred and they were being supplementing the appetites and the food for the Roman army. So they were supplying the Roman legions with pork. So they're raising unclean food for the most detestable group of people, the Roman occupiers. So we're replete with, or we're full of unclean in this story we're reading. So he meets this man with an unclean spirit, living among the unclean tombs, surrounded by people employed by an unclean occupation, all in an unclean territory. And think about this. This is one of those interesting aspects that one of the commentaries pointed out. It sounds like after this storm that the chaos and the evil of the sea attempted to stop Jesus in his tracks. Now we've got a demoniac trying to stop Jesus in his tracks. And this commentarian was trying to say, look, the demons, the evil is trying to keep Jesus from entering this region. Now, in our modern ears and modern eyes, that sounds like fairy tales. But when we recognize the supernatural, the things that go on that we don't understand, when we read from Jude about the fight over the body of, was it Abraham? I about lost it. When you read about this stuff that goes on that's beyond our physical world, it does make you wonder. There's no way of proving or anything like that, but it is an interesting thought that the evil was trying to keep Jesus from an area. But anyway, so Jesus is going to be approached by the man, and he's going to go beyond this idea of uncleanness. And the demoniac, he's going to fall on his knees. He's going to fall on his knees, and in a shout, like in a top of his voice, he's going to swear to God that you won't torture me. Swear to God that you won't torture me. And there is some obvious things that we can glean from this. First, the demons, the demoniac, is within this person who is now prostrating himself and even showing reverence or worship to Jesus. Basically, even for the demons, Jesus is a no contest situation. So the text continues, and when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and knelt down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Now, it's really important when we read those words, Son of the Most High God. Now, Most High God it's a polytheistic reference to God being above all those other Roman or Greek gods, those polytheistic gods. The Most High God is this epithet that's emphasizing his transcendence over all of them. It's beyond pagan gods and goddesses. It's the one true God. And that is the words that the demoniac is using, the Son of the Most High God. It is most definitely referencing who he is in front of everybody that is willing to listen. So we have this situation where the man that nobody could contain had these demons within, and Jesus is going to show that he is the Son of God. And there's no question about what Mark is trying to relay here. The unclean spirit's going to be expelled from the demon. Now, I did choose a couple of interesting pictures here. When I did the lesson last February, I showed a Eastern Orthodox icon related to the ladder of divinity, the ascension of the divine. I recognize that the Eastern Orthodox might use the icons a little differently than what we would think is okay. I think their intent is to utilize it to help them worship, and some people might say they worship the icons, the visuals. But the idea behind the Orthodox icons is that it's going to try to represent what we see physically and what is also going on supernaturally. And in that case of that ladder of the ascension, you saw the little demons trying to poke the aesthetic monks as they ascend up the ladder. Well, here you're seeing the demons who are leaving the demoniac and going into the pigs. So it's just interesting. I find visuals very, very cool. So that's why I share it. I don't share it because I believe there's any worthiness of the actual picture, but I do think from a visual person standpoint, I like the actual pictures. So we see that Jesus says, "Leave." They ask to go to the pigs, and with just words, Jesus is going to have them leave. And this is really important because they've found in Egypt the incantations and the special spells and words that would be used during exorcisms during this time period. And they were fancy, and they had all of these special things that they would have to utter and do. And all it takes from Jesus is to say, "Leave." And it's a fascinating way of pointing that out. So the demoniac asks, he says his name, "We're legion, for we are many." Now, that's not necessarily a name, that's a number. We know that the legion and the Roman legion, when they had their grip on Palestine, the legio is a troop unit in Rome, meaning 5,600 soldiers. It's not a split personality situation. There is this many, the 2,000 demons within him. It is the Roman legion, basically, of demons occupying him. Now, some people have tried to contradict whether this was added later, and there's no objective evidence of that. And if it had, wouldn't it have made more sense just to say there were 5,600 demons instead of 2,000? But the demons, however many in this legion, in this man, they show no challenge to Jesus. Instead, they plead for mercy, and the only alternative to experiencing his wrath, the evil spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd was 2,000 in number. They rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. So we see the conclusion of this. The people come. They see the man that had been this demoniac sitting normal and basically, not what they expected. He was infamous, and now he was in this new state. He was dressed, and he was in his right mind. Now, the story is going to continue that we'll just ignore the swine herders and the loss of income and all of that at this point, since we're running late. But one of the interesting aspects is the man wants to go with Jesus, and Jesus says no. Now, I'm confident we can come up with all kinds of suggestions on why Jesus would tell him no, because the words that he says sounds like he wants to be his disciple, and Jesus is saying no. But I think the point that I would rather focus on, rather than why would he say no, is that he says to go to his family and do what? Tell them what Jesus has done. One commentarian said this is the first instance of a Gentile being sent out to teach to Gentiles who Jesus was. It's an interesting thought. Now, this story is going to lead us into the last section of today's lesson. And when you look at these verses to the end of the chapter, this is a classic example of that sandwich technique that I've discussed a few times. We're going to see the healing of Jairus' daughter, and right in between, we're going to see the healing of the hemorrhaging woman. Now, as we've talked about, the story is typically, the rationale or the moral of the story is usually that sandwich part, the meat part, if you will. And that's what we're going to see here. So there's going to be two main characters that we're going to see. We're going to see Jairus, and he's a synagogue leader. And now a synagogue leader was very interesting because the synagogues didn't have preachers, they didn't have worship leaders, they didn't have those things. They had a synagogue leader that the elders of the community would appoint, and that they would make sure there were scrolls and people to pray and people to give a lesson. And they were basically the ones that assigned who was going to get up here and do things. And that's what Jairus was. He was a powerful man, and we know this because Mark names him. And it's not often that you see Mark naming people, and there's lots of reasons why Mark may name people, but in this instance, it's clearly because he's an important person, and he's the head of the local Jewish worshiping community. Now, by contrast, we're going to see in the middle a woman, no name, who has some issues. Now, Jairus is going to relay that his daughter is dying. The woman is, in fact, probably dying. She's hemorrhaging. She's desperate. She's basically depleted all of her income because she's been to the doctors. The flow won't stop. She's been suffering for a long time, and it's never gotten any better, and it's only getting worse. So we have a daughter that's dying, and we probably have a woman whose prospects aren't much better. So the only thing that these two people share in common, Jairus and the woman, is that they've heard of Jesus and that they have a need, and that need is to heal. And it's Mark's intention for us to see that the the privileged, the man, the one that has the respect of the community, is no different than the leper we saw in the first chapter. And the woman who is not respected, who, if you know about the rules of purity, the rules of purity would make her to where nobody could ever be around her, ever, because it wouldn't stop. Now, if you want extra study on either of these two, this is a very good work, the chapter 6 and chapter 7. Very, very interesting stuff. Obviously, it's not Bible, and it's a commentarian of sorts. It's a group of commentarians, but shows a lot of the ancient texts and what it meant to be impure. And we could do 2 lessons on that aspect of this alone, but she's impure. And both Jairus and the woman believe that contact with Jesus is sufficient for healing. In verse 23, put your hands on her, Jairus asks. In verse 28, if I just touch his clothes. So 2 dissimilar people, completely from different communities, one being ritually pure, one completely being impure, and they're both going to approach Jesus, and they're both going to get the same result, and that's the healing. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot more to both of those stories, but the sandwich part, why it's wrapping around the hemorrhaging woman's story, is because Mark wants us to see what kind of faith it takes to be with Jesus. What kind of faith should Jairus have? Well, the answer is it's the faith of the woman. She's going to exemplify. Remember, we talked early on about what crowds were. They were there to listen. They were an opportunity to teach, but really they were a hindrance of people to Jesus. And this woman made it through that crowd. She made it through this idea of a protective wall around Jesus, because she knew just a simple touch would heal her of this impurity that she had had for so long and had made her basically like a dead child, completely taken away from her community, her family, and all of those things that she knew. So it's a fantastic section of Mark, very powerful. And I think I'd like to end like this. I've told this story in at least one of my other classes, but there's a guy named Mark Golly. He wrote a book, When Did We Start Forgetting Jesus? And he talks about teaching this Mark section to a group of Laotians, and he goes through it in English, and then it gets translated into Laos, and he's talking about where are the storms? What are the storms in your life? And he asked the translator, what are the storms in your life? What are the troubles? What are the causes? What's the confusions? What makes you worried? And the Laotians gave him blank stares. And I've taught in Cambodia, and I've gotten those blank stares. I know how that feels. So he continues, well, ask them what their troubles are. And the translator asks, and you can see the Laotians, they're having this very dynamic conversation, and they're emphatic in the way they're talking. And he says, what is going on? And the translator said, well, they're discussing, did Jesus really calm the storm? And Mark Golly says, yeah, he did, absolutely. But what I want us to focus is, I want to make it personal. How does this affect your life? I don't want to get bogged down on miracles. So the translator said again, yes, he did calm the storm. So there was a lot of more emphatic discussion, and there was a pause. And one of the men said through the translator, with a measure of awe in his voice, if Jesus stilled the storm, he must be a very powerful person. They were basically asking, who then is this? They had grasped what Mark wanted to get from this text. They grasped who God was. through Jesus. What a powerful lesson these 3 miracles were. Thank you so very much for your attention today, and we'll continue on next week.